Greetings, Adirondack Wilderness Advocates supporters. My name is Pete Nelson. I am the board chair of Adirondack Wilderness Advocates, and I'm very happy to be here today to have a conversation about visitor use management. It's in the air right now. I was on the High Peaks Advisory Group that was convened by the state of Wisconsin, state of New York. I used to live in Wisconsin a few years ago, um, to look at ways to better manage the High Peaks Wilderness specifically. And we recommended visitor use management and the visitor use management framework as the appropriate best tool to manage and best protect the High Peaks wilderness. The state is also interested in doing that in the Catskills. So a few years ago, they convened two projects, two pilot projects, one in the Catskills and one in the High Peaks, to test visitor use management. They employed consultants who are experienced with visitor use management and structured the project and ran it over the last 2 years. And the report that was produced from that was released just a few weeks ago. They had it for a while. I think they were probably refining it, but it is out now for public comment. Public comments are accepted until June 1st. There were two public hearings, one for the Catskills, one for the High Peaks. We'll focus today on their recommendations for the High Peaks and where we might go from there. But first, we really need to talk about visitor use management itself. This is a big issue for the future of the park. It's a big issue for how we proceed in managing the park. It helps if we have expertise, and today we do. So I'd like to introduce Chad Dawson, who is joining us. Thank you so much for joining us, Chad, for this conversation.
Good morning. Glad to be here, Pete.
Chad is Professor Emeritus of Recreation Resources Management and former chair of the Faculty of Forest and Natural Resources Management at the State University of New York College of Environmental Science and Forestry in Syracuse, New York. He was a member of the APA, Adirondack Park Agency Board, for over 4 years. He is co-author of a standard in the literature, Wilderness Management, Stewardship and Protection of Resources and Values. The fifth edition of that book just came out a few months ago. Congratulations on that, Chad. He is on the board of directors of Adirondack Wild, and he has assisted Adirondack Wilderness Advocates as a technical advisor since 2021. So, if anybody is qualified to talk about visitor use management, certainly our guest is today. So I want to start with this, Chad. There's a lot of confusion about what VUM is. A lot of people really don't know what it is. They're seeing the acronym and they know it has something to do with how the forest preserve is managed. A lot of people that I talk to think that it's about visitor surveys and accommodating visitor desires. There are some people, including some in the environmental world, that are not really trusting it. They think it's a way to prioritize recreation over protection of wilderness, protection of the resource. So I find that the lack of understanding of VUM really gets in the way of being able to make smart policy decisions here. Can you talk broadly about what visitor use management is?
I think I have to start off by giving a little history. And I'm going to jump back and forth between the federal wilderness areas and land management. There's six federal land management agencies and the DEC operating in New York, both the Adirondack and the Catskills. The history is that VUM came from something called limits of acceptable change. It was done by the Forest Service, and every one of the federal agencies had a little different approach. And so eventually those came together. They had their own commission based from each of the agencies to pull together to create a new system that included LAC and other aspects that other agencies were using, but to give it a whole new name. And personally, I think they chose a bad name. Visitor use management. It keeps emphasizing the visitor. It sounds like that's the only thing it is, but it's not. Let's go back to LAC, limits of acceptable change. I think that's a better acronym to think about because both of them include environmental, biological resource conditions. They include the social, experiential condition of visitors and the management situation on the ground, what's available, what's allowed within the context of the law and the policies related to that piece of property. And those three things have to come together. And they did it in LAC, but again, it was the federal agencies. So you see a lot of DEC, unit management plans, UMPs, that keep referring back to LAC, and now they're translating that all to VUM. And it's a pretty good translation because there's a lot of similarities between one and the other. So if you're reading a unit management plan and you're wondering what LAC is, it's the precursor to VUM, which is now sanctioned by all six federal agencies, not just the Forest Service. But it's all based in a 10-step process for LAC, a 14-step process for VUM. And I could go through it. I don't want to get into a big lecture and throw PowerPoints at you or whatever, but basically, you have to start with the context you're in, and then you have to holistically look at the resource, environmental, biological conditions. So you have to look at the social, experiential conditions, and the managerial conditions. In fact, if you look at any report with DEC, they'll come back to this that's in the Adirondack Park State Land Master Plan. Uh, the planning for the forest preserve must include an assessment of physical, biological, and social carrying capacity of the area, with particular attention to portions of the area threatened by overuse. That's a really important thing. It's in page one of the current DEC consultant report. But the part that's missed is they must be done in concurrence with each other. You don't just do one and not the other. Imagine you went to a doctor and said to him, I want to run an ultra marathon. And the doctor says, well, tell me about your desired conditions. Well, I want to be able to run 3-minute miles, I want to win this race, blah, blah, blah. If they don't also ask you, what is your current actual condition, and measure that. If they don't ask you, what is the conditions you're running in, the environmental conditions you're running in? Is it a desert? Is it Arctic? Is it uphill? Is it downhill? An ultramarathon, 100 miles. What's the managerial conditions? Always, what are the rules of the race? If you can't bring all those together, you don't have a plan. You have to really understand all those things in concurrence. It's not just what visitors desire. That seems to always come back to what people think they want, but it's got to be coherent between those three principal components. We'll come back to this later, but the current DEC report does not include that, and I'll explain how that all came to be. Um, what else can I tell you to get started on this, Pete?
Sorry, repeat that.
What else helps your membership understand what this is? I've said that you have to have them all together. It has to be in the context of the policy and the legislation. They all have to be considered at the same time. Does that
Right.
make sense?
That makes perfect sense. That's certainly one of the things I want to talk about with the DEC report, which we'll get to in a
Right.
bit. I have two questions. If I look at the variety of activities to protect the Adirondack Forest Preserve that are well known, um, not just the ones that the DEC has done itself, the one that really stands out to me as a VUM project, whether in name or not, is the Summit Steward program, which measures a
Mhm.
variety of things. In your mind, is that the kind of complete approach that we need to have, where they are setting desired conditions on summits and measuring a variety of things and adapting to those to protect them? Is that a VUM project in your mind?
It is. It's not complete in a couple senses because we don't know what the best desired conditions are environmentally. No one's ever really measured. They've measured impacts. But the whole process of VUM is that you do it over time. It's an adaptive management process. That's one important thing to understand. So you start it, and then you have to monitor and make sure you're going to reach all your goals related to, managerial conditions, related to social conditions, related to environmental conditions. It can't be just one or other of those. The other thing is it's a closed loop system. In other words, the feedback you get from doing the monitoring should help you refocus and adapt the management. It can't be disconnected from that. It has to be closed. And that's something that state and federal agencies always get nervous about because when they set up the plan, they have to have thought through what it is that they're going to do over time, and that makes it public. They have to disclose what it is they're doing and tell you whether or not they're achieving that closed loop system. The current system in Unfortunately, many federal areas, and certainly with the DEC, is that they like to kind of keep all the cards very close to their chest, saying, yes, we're meeting environmental conditions, yes, we're meeting managerial conditions. But I ask, where's the report?
Sure. Yeah. You mentioned closed loop system. That seems to me to have been a perennial issue throughout the decades that I've been involved in Adirondack issues. Even good initiatives don't necessarily have the measurement and feedback that they need to have in order to be coherent. And certainly this, obviously is a much more coherent approach by design. There is another question this leads to, though, which is I have heard objections from quite a few people, including people in the state, that they just don't have the resources for this. That VUM is, very resource. This is going to be very resource intensive. We already, can't finish our UMPs. This is an onerous amount of work. Is that true? Is VUM resource intensive?
It depends on what level you want to take it to. So what you find in VUM is this very clever way of scoping it, deciding how much you have in resources, what your major goals are, and what you have to do to check on whether or not that's happening. So you can adjust that. You don't have to do everything. That's not physically, economically possible in many situations. So I find that sort of a straw man argument that they're really not telling you the whole truth because VUM is designed for all of these levels. You can do it locally, you can do it at a large region, but you decide what the intensity of monitoring is. But you always come back to the fact that, yes, we achieved it, we didn't achieve it. This is what we're doing to make sure we hit it again. That's what agencies are really worried about. They don't like accountability. They want discretion. And that's the words they will use if you argue these facts with them. They don't want to be locked in. They don't want to have someone be able to look over their shoulder. And as citizens and visitors and users and uh, what we say, taxpayers, we should have accountability. And that's what VUM and the predecessor LAC were all about, was
Sure,
accountability, so that anybody could look over their shoulder and say, oh, yes, you're doing a great job,
sure.
or
And
not.
again, right. I think that makes a lot of sense. I don't have the expertise in VUM that you do, but AWA has its own VUM project we run for a few years at Jenkins Mountain at Paul Smith's Vic. Um,
Mhm.
it was measuring the impacts and the various dimensions of a backcountry ski trail system. And one of the things that I always believed about VUM that I think has proven out a little bit there is just what you said. We don't have to measure everything. One of the smart things that we found with VUM is that you come up with common sense indicators that are more important than others. You make some decisions about what it is that you want to measure. For example, when we started that project, we wanted to measure impact on the canopy. But as it happens, there really isn't anything that occurs in those trails, how they were designed, how they're used, that impacts the canopy. So we dropped those. There are other indicators like erosion that struck us as more important. So a handful of smart indicators struck us as much more effective than indicators for every last thing. That's one of the things I think people underestimate about this. The adaptive and iterative part actually makes it less onerous in our experience. Is that a reasonable way to look at it?
Absolutely. I'm familiar with
Is
the
that a
Jenkins
reasonable
Mountain
way from your
project.
perspective? Yeah, yeah,
Absolutely. I think it's the only way to do it and not use the excuse, and I'm going to use that word, excuse, that, oh, we can't do it, we don't have enough. What do you have and what can you do with what you have? I think that's the better, more focused question, not, oh, we can't do everything. Of course you can't do everything. There
right.
are other examples. I worked in 2020 with the Adirondack Park Agency staff and a few DEC staff and began to create a VUM workbook in terms of how you go about these things, giving examples in campgrounds and trails and other things. And unfortunately, that all got lost somewhere in the agency. And it's unfortunate that that never saw the light of day because what that was exactly what you're talking about, Pete, which is what can you do and why is it important to do? State what it is and why you're doing it, and then tell us how it turned out. And it's not just telling us, you're telling yourself because you can adapt the management to it. So there are a lot of good examples of how this is done and done well and done contextually. done with limited resources, because everybody has limited resources, and still do it to improve the overall sustainability, really, of the experience, the resource, and the kinds of experiences people can have in that area.
Sure. So let's talk about this DEC report. It was released.
Mhm.
Supporters, I don't know how many of you've had a chance to look at it. It's publicly available. It's a slog, but if you just
Mhm.
read the first portions of it, you get a pretty good idea of what the state wanted out of this. And they really focused on broadly two things. They focused on parking issues and the crowding attendant to parking issues. And they also focused on crowding on trails and summits, by which they meant how people feel about crowding on trails and summits. So
Mhm.
we've digested the report. We're preparing multi-page comments on it without tipping our hand. Chad, you've read the report. What are your impressions of that report?
I'm going to go back to the history of it. So I asked the DEC staff when this proposal came out to get consultants to do this work, where's the rest of VUM? And they responded, and there's a sentence on page 2 of the report that says the project was intentionally focused on visitor experiences and public safety to augment DEC's internal capacity to address resource-related monitoring and management. And my question is, where's that other part? Where are those two parts? Resource-related management, resource-related monitoring, and their management assessments. It's not in this report. So when they talk about so much density, so many people in a parking lot, et cetera, give these upper and lower bounds, what's that based on besides the social component? Where's the environmental component of that? Where's the managerial component? In other words, do we have the staff to deal with the trail degradation that will occur given X number of people? Do we have the staff to deal with law enforcement to make sure they only use the designated parking area? None of that is in this report. So the report is good as far as it goes, but there's two-thirds of the information missing.
Sure. And that's certainly something we're making in our comments. They do mention in the report that they know that they need to do ecological and biological assessment, but they
Mhm.
it's sort of mentioned and then they move on because, as you said, they didn't do that. I was kind of interested in their methodology for measuring crowding, however you define that, and let me put my cards on the table. I think definitions of crowding and definitions of solitude, obviously interrelated, are pretty complicated. They're certainly subjective. They should be measured, certainly, but I think it's difficult to do that without beginning with some assumptions that may not be fully examined. So they measured crowding on summits by producing a series of photographs that showed different levels of people on the summit and asked their respondents to their survey to comment on when they felt like it was finally too many people on the summit. Uh, do you think that's an effective methodology, even for the scope of what they had to measure uh, visitor impressions of their hiking?
It's an interesting partial treatment of the topic, but it's extremely incomplete because, for example, I had a graduate student at ESF that went for 3 months hiking through the Adirondacks, asking people, the similar kind of questions, but then also saying, why are you here in this particular unit today hiking? Why aren't you in this other unit? And they would say, well, because it's too crowded there now. And so one of the sociological phenomena are displacement. If I keep going to the high peaks and I find it's too crowded for me, I'm going to try somewhere else. I'm going to try more remote places in the high peaks off trail, or I'm going to go to another area that's less used. And so this displacement phenomena is not accounted for in people's preferences. It's the preferences of people who are there now, not the people who used to be there or the people who might be there. So all of this gets very complicated. So I like what they do, but again, even I think their social science is incomplete. And certainly it's incomplete because when you ask somebody, this is what you see, you're not also telling them this is the environmental impacts of having that many people here, or these are the management problems with having this many people here. So it's incomplete socially, it's incomplete in terms of all VUM having those three major components that you can bring together simultaneously.
Sure. I teach statistics, and this is a classic case of self-selection bias, right? Those are the people there, and they've chosen to be
Mhm.
there, and they have a different set of values maybe than people who haven't. There's another thing that's part of what you mentioned, displacement. There seems to be an assumption that the right thing to do is to limit the number of hikers on these trails. Again, we can't really say to protect the resource because they don't measure that, but nonetheless, that's an assumption, and that presupposes that having those hikers dispersed to other locations is better for the ecology and the biology of the forest preserve than having them concentrated on that site. Is that an issue that has is that a reasonable issue to examine in a different way than we have in this report?
Well, there's really two parts to that. One is when we're looking at what you're describing, there's a couple things happening. One is that we don't know for sure what it is that people have as their reference point. So we'll call it their internal baseline. We don't know that. We have to find out about their internal baseline and how they would rank this in other areas. So we understand the sliding rule they're measuring under. And then we need the agency to say this particular wilderness area is in this sliding scale of the conditions of wilderness we allow. Is this going to be the heavier use area? And are we going to accommodate that managerially? None of that's in here. We don't know what the background of these people is. We don't know what their experience level is, what they've experienced before, that area over time, other areas, etc. We don't know what it is that DEC thinks the high peaks should be in the spectrum of wilderness areas that are available in the high peaks. So this is why VUM tries to bring all these things together and really assess it coherently and not just pick one piece and go with it.
So let's finish with this. They picked one piece and they went there and they did this project and they issued the report. We want the state to adopt visitor use management. It's a smart
Mhm.
framework. The adaptive management idea, the iterative idea is so important for a place that is
Great.
facing more and more dynamic challenges from climate to crowding to invasive species. These are dynamic things. So, where do we go from here? What should the state and stakeholders do next? We have this piece in hand. The state's trying to learn something more about visitor use management.
Mhm.
What should we do
Mhm.
next?
Well, I think the other part to bring to bear on this is what does the environmental resource side of it, what are their conditions currently actual and desired conditions, and how does that mesh or not mesh with the social conditions? That's certainly one. And the other is managerially, what is it that you can or can't do in this area to reduce environmental impacts or to reduce social conditions? Let me give you an example. You can harden a trail, which is happening in some areas in the high peaks and not other areas. How much of that do you want to allow and where is appropriate? Or are these the right locations for these trails? Is it the location of the trail that's causing a problem because it's running up a drainage, that type of thing? The second round of this is to really look at managerially, what do we have the capacity to do? What can we sustain over time? What partners can we bring into the process to keep sustaining that over time? I don't think it's a one and done. As you say, adaptive management is extremely important. And I think they have to design the process that way. It can't just be looking at social conditions. It's a very incomplete picture. It's a good start. I don't fault the contractors because that's what they were given by DEC to do. I say it's time for DEC to try and bring all it to bear and show us what it is the other components are and how do they all fit together or not.
So, would you recommend that the DEC convene a second pilot project, a second project that's a companion to this piece that adds those ecological, biological, and management measures, and basically continue what they started, but round it out with these other pieces, keeping the scope to the trails and the summits that they're looking at, but doing these other things and letting it run for 2 years and learn what they can about that and produce a second report before we make any decisions. Is that Is that a viable path?
That would be what I would recommend. I think that's completely spot on because without that other information, we don't know. And then when we have it, we can begin looking at the social and say, well, these don't match. They don't match. The social can take a lot more visitor impact adjustment than the environment can. Or maybe the trails are the problem. We've got to relocate the trails, those kinds of things. That that's what the iterations of adaptive management and planning tell you is where are the weak spots? Where are the choke points in this process? Maybe trails should only go one direction. That would solve the desired conditions problem because you know as long as you walk about the same speed, you're not going to see much of anybody else except the back of the person ahead of you and the people coming up behind you, as opposed to passing each other. So there's so much that's involved in all of this that's not here.
Sure. Well, listen, I think it's very clear talking with you that visitor use management isn't about just accommodating visitors. It's interesting that you started off talking about the fact that the name itself and the acronym is troubling because it seems to
Right.
put that
It is.
focus.
It is.
I think our supporters can have a much clearer picture that this is a comprehensive way to look at how you protect this resource and all the
Right.
pieces that go into that. And again, in a highly dynamic environment, the more that we can adapt and the more quickly we can adapt, the better. So I think this has been very helpful for me and for
Okay.
those who tune in. So I would like to thank you for your time. We
Okay.
will be posting this, and we look forward to future times when we have a chance to talk with you and tap your wisdom. So thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you. And I appreciate having the time to speak with you. And I look forward to hearing your supporters as they post their commentary and interest in all of this. And hopefully we'll see each other on the trail.
Yes, hopefully we will. Thank you very much.